So I've been building up to this theme, which is the option of radical forgiveness, which wasn't taken um, before or during or after World War One, which is just being used as an example, basically, an example of how we do things in such a wrong way, and we do them over and over again. Um, and So we shouldn't mistake the example for the point, I guess, because the ultimate point that I'm playing with here is whether it's not better for us and for everybody to not react even when we're sorely challenged. I realize that people think of this option as extremely utopian. It's the part of Christianity, for instance, which is the hardest thing for people to actually do, or even to really to even advocate, especially when it comes to international relations or even domestic politics. The stakes are so high, and it seems as though when you're slapped that you need to slap back because conventional wisdom goes that the only way that you won't continually be slapped is if you show that you're capable of slapping back. So just to remind you of where we've come so far with looking at John Maynard Keynes' book, The Economic Consequences of the Peace, which was published in 1919 in the aftermath of the First World War during the peace treaty, that he was there. It was after the Versailles Treaty had been accomplished, but it reads as though he was there because he was there during the negotiations. So just to recap, the situation that he has described so far, it boils down to a sort of tragic situation, basically. He talked about the economic interdependence that the Europeans had developed, with Germany fueling European economic growth, but all of these European countries being tied together economically, so that if something happened to one, it would have a ripple effect on all. He talked about the increasing precarity of Europe regarding its food, that its population had expanded because of industrialization and urbanization, had led to more and more people not being able to provide for themselves and their own food. And furthermore, that this mass population was becoming very dependent upon imported foods. So they were in a situation of great precarity. One lost opportunity to not react was at this beginning when the Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated by the Serbian dissident, or whatever we want to call him. If Austria-Hungary and Germany had not reacted, or had reacted differently with much smaller measures, right, then perhaps the entire war would have been avoided. But it was not to be the case. And what they got was what ironically no one expected in their psychic depths, you might say. They did not accept, did not fathom that the war that they were going to have to fight as a result of reacting and of upholding their secret treaties and agreements was total war. It was war like they had never seen before. Now, there was a little precursor to this that if they had been paying attention, actually, they would have known, perhaps, by watching the American Civil War. Same thing there. Even after the Civil War, Americans retained the sort of romantic notion of war and didn't fully fathom what they'd just been through and the reality of how the technology of warfare had led to a situation where the damage was so great and the price was so high that no sane human being would ever do it, would never start it. So in World War I, it's the second lesson, basically, but still they had not fathomed this. Even as they were undergoing it, they didn't fathom totally what they were in and what the difference was between the way that they had imagined warfare and the way they had done warfare in the past, and what happened during that war. It destroyed Europe, and the aftermath was this devastation, right, of poverty, starvation, total chaos that had to be somehow brought back under control. And Keynes is looking at this and realizing that the Versailles Treaty turns out to be this like treaty of vengeance that is going to try to extract as much as possible out of Germany as the loser of the war, as humanly possible. But the problem, of course, is that of the interdependence and the precarity, right? So that by doing this, again, reacting in this case with vengeance, the Allied powers were dooming themselves, right? So in this part of the book, he describes this crew of negotiators, great men all, right, who are woefully lacking in the basic substance to deal with this situation in a way that will benefit everybody ultimately. So they're lacking in imagination. That's the number one thing, like imagination, to be able to imagine that one could do things differently, right? That it didn't have to be punitive, that one could let go, that people could let go. It's hard, but they could. So they lacked imagination, maturity, wisdom, and skill. So he really unmasks these supposedly great leaders for what they really are, because as he knew before it actually happened, he knew that this level of devastation followed by this level of punitive extraction of resources from the economic powerhouse of Europe was going to lead to huge economic problems and future conflict. So he was totally right about that, as we know. The treaty, as well, the war itself and the treaty that came out of it, and the deprivations that caused, and the slowdown of the economy that caused, was a huge ingredient in what created the Great Depression, and a huge and irrefutable ingredient in what led to the Second World War. And we now know, like, the suffering and devastation that came out of that, including the invention and use of nuclear weapons. These are the three main players involved in the negotiations, really. Lloyd George, who was the British Prime Minister, Clemenceau, who was the French Prime Minister, and Woodrow Wilson, who was the US President. And together they were really the parties that put together the Treaty of Versailles. And this was another missed opportunity to not react and to not take punitive, vengeful, greedy measures. It's interesting how Keynes deals with these central characters. He says of Clemenceau that Clemenceau held the policy of an old man who couldn't wrap his head around the fact that they'd moved on from the old endless internecine war power politics situation into unknown territory, the unknown territory of mass interdependence and total war technology. Even after the war, he was still living in a world where there would always be this conflict between France and Germany, and frankly, France and England as well. He was living in that world where the European conflicts would continue on, and he had to do what it takes to prepare for the next one and to weaken his enemies accordingly. He was living in the old world, right, before the precarity, before the interdependence. Keynes characterized the way Clemenceau thought about the situation in this way. He said, a piece of magnanimity or a fair and equal treatment based on ideology, like the 14 points of the president, Wilson, could only have the effect of shortening the interval of Germany's recovery and hastening the day when she would once again hurl at France her greater numbers and her superior resources and technical skill. So the logical thing to do from this old man's perspective was to like weaken Germany as much as possible, because he didn't fathom that his own economy and his own country's well-being was inextricably bound to Germany's and every other country. He was still, you might argue, centuries behind in his way of thinking. Not to mention his mustache. Nobody should have a mustache that basically like picks up all the food you eat because it's way too long and makes you look like a walrus. But that's another thing. Then we have Woodrow Wilson here. Now, the previous comment about the 14 points would make you think that maybe Keynes admired Woodrow Wilson, but really not. And Keynes is like a master of using words in a very biting, but still diplomatic and subtle way. So he says, for instance, of Woodrow Wilson, the president was not a hero or a prophet. He was not even a philosopher, but a generously intentioned man with many of the weaknesses of other human beings and lacking that dominating intellectual equipment, which would have been necessary to cope with the subtle and dangerous spellbinders, which, by the way, that's reference to Lloyd George, whom a tremendous clash of forces and personalities had brought to the top as triumphant masters in the swift game of give and take, face to face in council, a game of which he had no experience at all. So basically, he looks at Woodrow Wilson, the American president, as a rube of sorts, basically, who wasn't subtle intellectually enough to deal with this stuff that these like power politics players like Lloyd George and Clemenceau were engaging in. He couldn't keep up with them. Also, he says, for instance, what chance would such a man have against Lloyd George's unerring, almost medium-like sensibility to everyone immediately around him? He depicts Lloyd George as just this incredible politic character, like, you know, say what you will, he's trying to get everything he can for England, right? But he is this canny, like, just political genius type for you know, running circles around people like Woodrow Wilson, according to Keynes. Also, and I found this interesting because this, to me, like smacked of the American character more generally, I have to say. That's something that would, you know, should give us pause, basically. He says, the president was like a nonconformist minister, perhaps a Presbyterian. His thought and his temperament were essentially theological, not intellectual, with all the strengths and weaknesses of that manner of thought, feeling, and expression. Now that captures a part of the American like imagination and personality to the T. Okay, first of all, we don't produce a lot of like brilliant intellectuals, let's face it. Some, but not, you know, Europe has produced more, other parts of the world have produced more. Why? Because Americans are so hung up on like practical, you know, Ferengi like, you know, negotiations over money, like, and things that they can't, you know, like they can't be bothered to like actually devote serious mental energy to something that seems so like mundane, or no, they can't devote mental energy to that which is not mundane. This is not necessarily a virtue. It's actually it's a vice. Okay, it describes though the American character. We don't put out a lot of intellectuals. A lot of times the people in charge really are not all that you know, brilliant. They have a certain intelligence, but they're not, you know, real thinkers. And then they tend to be more of this minister type. Now, you might think by this quote that he's saying that, well, Woodrow Wilson was like religious and he was going on, he was acting in accordance with like Christian principles, or at least as he thought they would be. But I don't think that's what he's trying to capture here. He's talking about the sort of optimistic, crusading spirit, right? That's just like, hey, I know what's right. I've got these 14 points. It's all about, you know, all of us countries cooperating with each other and not doing this anymore. And you know, like being nice, even to Germany. But he didn't, you know, like Keynes basically says he had these 14 points and he had a lot of money. Doesn't that describe the United States? They have the ideas, they have a lot of money, but he had no follow through, no like actual practical follow through to actually get anything done. And he certainly wasn't prepared to deal with these heavy duty negotiators. And he was also pretty concerned about his public persona. And so, you know, he played the political game badly, basically, and allowed them to kind of run roughshod over him as long as they paid lip service to the 14 points. As long as if in public he looked like he was making an impression and doing something positive, especially because the last point of the 14 points is about the League of Nations. And as long as he could, you know, own that he was promoting that idea, then he was bringing kind of a God's goodness into the world, right? The idea, the American idea of justice, right? And fair play and things like that, right? But meanwhile, he really wasn't accomplishing anything. And because of his impotence, he was allowing others to, you know, basically do whatever they wanted to do. And as you know, like Germany saw this as an ultimate betrayal, right? That they had surrendered on the basis of these 14 points, and that the American president, with all of its power and money, you know, would come to their aid and would make sure that this was done right, and that they would not have all these punitive measures and extractions, and they'd be able to like move on. But that didn't happen at the Versailles Treaty. And President Woodrow Wilson failed, although he never would admit it, of course. It's always a great success. Whatever you do, the American leadership always pronounces it a great success. This is today's beer. I thought it was kind of appropriate. I try to pick appropriate beers. And so the United States has pulled out of Afghanistan. I'm talking about the full 20 some years that the United States has been in Afghanistan and what precipitated it, right? On 9/11, a terrible thing happened in this country, but it's something that similar tragedies like that happen around the world all the time. But it was new for the United States. And it seemed to call for a reaction. Now, we could have chosen any reaction, including a small one, and it probably would have been enough to satisfy most Americans ultimately. But we chose to intervene in Afghanistan and Iraq. And particularly Afghanistan, but both really, became quagmires quite predictably. And ultimately we have to admit, well, no, we don't, like, but maybe we should admit that nothing good came out of that. That's a tragedy of that situation. Nothing good ultimately has come out of it. It might have been better. And in fact, I would venture to say it would have been better had we not reacted at all, which is probably impossible, or it would have been better if we had reacted with a very small action. It would have been better for them, of course, but it would have been far better for us. So one of the things that Keynes writes about here, about France in particular, France's attitude, which like struck me in this regard as kind of parallel. He says of Clemenceau that he felt about France what Pericles felt of Athens. Unique value in her, nothing else mattering. But his theory of politics was of Bismarck's. He had one illusion, France, and one disillusion, mankind, including Frenchmen and his colleagues, not the least. His principles for the peace can be expressed simply. In the first place, he was a foremost believer in the view of German psychology, and that the German understands and can understand nothing but intimidation, that he is without generosity or remorse in negotiation, that there is no advantage he will not take of you, and no extent to which he will not demean himself for profit, that he is without honor, pride, or mercy. Therefore, you must never negotiate with a German or conciliate him. You must dictate to him. Now, I'm not saying there's a complete parallel here, but I am saying that when the United States decided to react to that terrible situation with total vengeance, right? Like a massive reaction, we did have a choice, and we could have chosen a more moderate reaction or even no reaction. Now, I would say that ultimately we'd be better off if there was no reaction other than actually, taking care of ourselves, beefing up our defenses perhaps, but thinking of them only as defensive to prevent such things. Making sure that we're more independent from undue precarity, right? And interdependence that creates a situation in which the interests in other parts of the world have to be your interests. We would have been better off. We would have been better off. We would have had more security. We don't have the equipment to, whatever that is, to prevail in that conflict. So I'll leave it at that. I think we have to learn these lessons ultimately, right? People need to learn the history. And we need to do better.